It was interesting to see Susan.
Yeah, it was
Suddenly,
good to see her.
she's in the cold part of the world still.
Yeah,
Okay.
we were talking about South America or South Africa.
Yeah.
I met a woman this summer from South Africa and Zimbabwe, and who's here, and had a pretty interesting conversation.
Yeah, I'm going to excuse myself for a moment.
Okay, I'll reread paragraph 860. So paragraph 860, reread as we cut off before. This text shows clearly that synchronistic magical happenings are regarded as being dependent on effects. Naturally, Albertus Magnus, in accordance with the spirit of his age, explains this by postulating a magical faculty in the soul, without considering that the psychic process itself is just as much arranged as the coinciding image which anticipates the external physical process. This image originates in the unconscious and therefore belongs to those cogitationes que sunt a nobis independentes, which would probably be independent thoughts, or thoughts independent of us, which, in the opinions of Arnold Geulincx, are prompted by God and do not spring from our own thinking, which confirms that there. Goethe thinks of synchronistic events in the same magical way. Thus, he says in his conversations with Eckermann, we all have certain electric and magnetic powers within us and ourselves exercise an attractive and repelling force, according as we come into touch with something like or unlike. And it's interesting to me there that like or unlike, some people say like attracts like, unlike repels like. But if you look at magnets, like repels like, and unlike attracts like. So I think it depends on the context of the situation, where when Goethe says we all have certain electric and magnetic powers within us, and ourselves exercise an attractive and repelling force, according as we come into touch with something like or unlike. I think that's goes back to the context of not necessarily dependent on particular effects, but the effects that occur in any given situation. Do you have any thoughts, Skip, on 860?
I didn't look at just a second. Well, I think that I've been talking about how, in my experience, a coinciding image does anticipate an external physical process.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's what the synchronicities that I always point to have been doing. The fact that I could even get them on some sort of media meant that, right? And because otherwise you can't even get them on media, and they're dastardly difficult to catch. I mean, I luckily have caught three. One on still imagery, and two because I was running video. And probably there's several more that I've been running video, but
well, and he was talking about timing so much. I mean, he never used the word auspicious, but astrologically, the word auspicious timing, would come up directly from what he was talking about in previous paragraphs, to where I would say this Goethe's talk about we all have certain electric and magnetic powers within us, that I could then look at astrology as simply the personalities of planetary magnetism, and how one attracts and repels. And it's interesting, some people say like attracts like, and some people say, dislike repels, dislike. And what's interesting though with magnets, North Pole, South Pole, like repels like, and dislike attracts, dislike. So it's interesting that sometimes, there's the whole opposites attract thing, which comes from that. But then putting both those together, it reminds me of John Cleese in an episode of Cheers way back in the 80s, where, Sam and Diane are talking about how opposites attract, and they go into this huge thing, and John Cleese just starts laughing. And they say, "What's so funny?" He goes, opposites attract. That's the song of the truly desperate. So
yeah.
So, you just don't know. I think so, again, in this whole, being dependent on effects. Well, sure. And then the effects have different characteristics, even when they occur at different times based on where they are in context.
Yeah. Okay, let me read 861 then, and we'll get out through 862. That I think we're gonna take a break for this week. Okay, after these general considerations, let us return to the problem of the empirical basis of synchronicity. The main difficulty here is to procure empirical material from which we can draw reasonably certain conclusions. And unfortunately, this difficulty is not an easy one to solve. The experiences in question are not ready at hand. We must therefore look in the obscurest corners and summon up courage to shock the prejudices of our age if we want to broaden the basis of our understanding of nature. When Galileo discovered the moons of Jupiter with his telescope, he immediately came into head-on collision with the prejudices of his learned contemporaries. Nobody knew what a telescope was and what it could do. Never before had anyone talked of the moons of Jupiter. Naturally, every age thinks that all ages before it were prejudiced, and today we think that this more than ever, and are just as wrong as all previous ages that thought so. How often have we not seen the truth condemned? It is sad, but unfortunately true, that man learns nothing from history. This melancholy fact will present us with the greatest difficulties as soon as we set about collecting empirical material that would throw a little more light on this dark subject, for we shall be quite certain to find it where all the authorities have assured us that nothing is to be found. I'll just read on. 862, reports of remarkable isolated cases, however well authenticated, are unprofitable and lead at most to their reporter being regarded as a credulous person. Even the careful recording and verification of a large number of such cases, as in the work of Gurney, Myers, and Podmore, have made next to no impression on the scientific world. The great majority of professional psychologists and psychiatrists seems to be completely ignorant of these researches. Okay, amen.
Yeah, I think the one that comes to mind, and I'll just to stick with the Jupiter theme there. In the 50s, there was a Russian scientist. His name I think was like Palachekikov or something like that. I know it ends with KOV, but that's not too out of the ordinary. But he postulated from his research that Venus was actually a part originally of Jupiter.
Yeah.
That it then knocked off. And in that, he was demonized to the point of actually being exiled from academia. That this idea that Venus was part of Jupiter. Well, then that's in the 50s. And then come along and we have the Venus probe that NASA sends out. And the first thing they find is that Venus is, it was originally part of Jupiter.
Right.
And so, what the truth be damned, as it would be from, what everyone else had postulated, but his research was more accurate. And what's interesting is haven't seen it, but I would gather he probably eliminated some false assumptions in the hypothesis and his calculations, and then come to find out even more that the whole Kuiper belt, the asteroid belt, which is pretty much the shield for the Earth, is created by Jupiter, because basically things get knocked into inner orbit within Jupiter by Jupiter crashing through them. So in that sense, there's a whole, the asteroid belt is kind of a chain link fence in space, as it would be, to stop some, incoming objects. And it's not always aligned with the Earth, obviously. So it's not, in any way, doesn't have a bunch of holes in it, or just not even present. But I think the whole idea that someone in the 50s could say that Venus was part of Jupiter originally and be so chastised, so demonized as to be actually exiled from academia. And then the retribution of, they send the Venus probe in and, oh, he was dead on accurate. And, oh, but wait, not only that, and so they go even further that, again, truth be damned. So facts, damn facts, and then the statistics. And when the statistics enter the science, there's a problem.
Yeah. Right. So there's another time when Jung brought up the moons of Jupiter, and it's worth repeating because it's one of the most important paragraphs in Jungian psychology. And his criticism was that basically it's a criticism that is made recently too in a book where it says, well, in the scientific method, the scientists get to decide what is on the table. So they
right.
They skew the results for their own purposes. But here is what he was saying, and this is in paragraph 63 of Ion. And here's what he says. Philosophical criticism will find, and he's referring here to shadow, syzygy, and the self, and he's criticized for these ideas. But so he says, philosophical criticism will find everything to object to. Wait a minute. To object to in them, unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts, and that the concept is simply an abbreviated description or definition of those facts. Such criticism has as little effect on the object as zoological criticism on the duck-billed platypus. It is not the concept that matters. The concept is only a word, a counter, and it has meaning and use only because it stands for a certain sum of experience. Unfortunately, I cannot pass on this experience to my public. I've tried to in a number of publications with the help of case material to present the nature of these experiences and also the method of obtaining them. Wherever my methods were really applied, the facts I give have been confirmed. One could see the moons of Jupiter even in Galileo's day if one took the trouble to use his telescope.
Yeah, and that's the thing too. The people who don't take the trouble to actually look, and they're just playing with well, I need this grant, so I need a research paper that's accepted and published that takes this into account and has this as the result. And the problem is that's just snake oil salesman reverse engineering, except reverse engineering only cherry picking the points and pieces that support what you want the product to be. That's not science. That's just chicanery.
And so Jung's point is that you can write encyclopedias about the duck-billed platypus, but the duck-billed platypus, but you're not a duck-billed platypus, and you'll never know what it's really like to be a duck-billed platypus.
Right.
And
Well,
why?
it's like there's a far side, and I think there's a far side. I think it was a far side or an imitator. Pardon me, but it had arranged marriages gone wrong in nature, and they have this beaver, and then they have this duck, and they're at a wedding. They are in a wedding ceremony, and then you say, here's the duck-billed platypus. But sometimes nature doesn't steer very well. So I mean, what's interesting even about them is I think that they have a venom, or and that I think they're actually venomous too.
Oh,
I think
boy.
their tail is.
Well, on that topic, I don't know, but in any case, Jung took a pot shots at scientists very often, although he thought he was a scientist, because the others would refuse to, listen to him or pay any attention to his findings.
Yeah, and I think he was out on his own frontage roads, blazing new trails. And I think the thing is, he did have that scientific, because he had been a doctor. I mean, you have to be a doctor, MD, prior to psychiatry, but he had been on the front lines of, the mental institutions and some serious. So basically, he had gone to war in the psyche, with the psyche, around the psyche. And I think that he had a very, very astute eye, and he would pick up things, and he would also pick up things regardless of how they supported or something. He was curious to actually express them rather than I'm trying to prove X, Y, or Z. He's like, no, we'll figure out which letter we're proving once we get to the proof. We don't know what's on the other side of the equal sign until we get there. And I think that's an important piece with him.
Right. Okay. So line end of program. I just have a story to tell, because others may have this experience, and I had an experience on Friday having nothing to do with Jungian psychology. I was pretty tired after a week of teaching school in 3 different schools on Friday, and I came home, and my wife told me that my mother-in-law had a big crisis in her kitchen, and water was coming up through the drain in her sink. And so, I didn't really focus on it right away. I had my dinner, but then I said, okay, I better go over and take a look at this, right? And so there was water coming up through the drain in her sink, and she's got a garbage disposal there. So I'm saying, how can that be happening? Because garbage disposals are one way, right? Well, no, actually not. Okay, because we live in buildings which are sort of 2.5 stories tall. And it turns out that the drain for people's kitchen waste and their garbage disposals, and also their washing machines, are vertical gravity drains. And if it gets stopped up, the water will come back up through these drains. And of course, the first one it gets to is the lowest on the totem pole. And so my mother-in-law's all of a sudden getting this water up. So we drained it a couple of times, and we had to muddle through until yesterday morning, because we couldn't get a plumber late Friday evening. And so about 9 o'clock at night, I'm there, and all of a sudden, all this stuff starts to come up. And I had a huge, one of these huge basins that you can use to dry your or wash your dishes in, right?
Right.
And I had a 2.5 gallon bucket. And so I was literally using the basin to fill up the bucket, then running in the bathroom and dropping the water down the toilet, and then running back and doing it over and over again. I took 13 2.5 gallon buckets of water out of her sink, which I estimate to be about 25 gallons. And obviously the sink that only holds maybe 4 gallons. So if I hadn't been physically there, her house would have been totally inundated by this thing. And so, you know, I had this madcap 45 minutes of bailing out her kitchen sink. And finally Debbie went up to the upstairs places and said, you know, you can't wash clothes or wash dishes until we get the plumber in. And it turned out that's what it was. And he was drilling out, you know, he snaked out about 70 feet of the line that goes out to the sewer line. And then it works fine, I guess. But
well, and that kind of clogged too. I mean, for it to back up, then the thing is the clog size has to be commensurate with that much volume. So it's usually, you know, 8-10 feet long. Often a root or even just some kind of abrasion within the pipe will catch a hair, and then hair is really strong. And then something gets caught in that, and little by little, you basically have a net that's starting to.
And the plumber said it was these are old lead pipes that have gotten corroded too, and so that's what, you know, attracts the crud after a while. You got to clear it out. But, whoa. So I had to stay awake basically all Friday night and check that sink every half hour just to make sure that it wasn't having another one of these bouts.
Well, I love that plumbing is kind of a good metaphor for the psyche and the unseen flows, because, for example, when high rises were first started, they had all of these problems with these huge leaks. Well, they finally realized that every floor or two, they needed to L the pipe, because if in the top of the Empire State Building, the water dropped down a pipe to all the way to the bottom floor, and then the pipe turned, it would just keep going and it would punch through the pipe. So because it reached terminal velocity, basically.
Sure.
And you know, in the directed force of a pipe becomes a water arrow, basically, or a water cannon. And so even then later, building code stipulates if water pipes are going to drop X number of feet, you have to have some kind of slow them down L or other device so that the water does not continue to accelerate. I mean, so pipes are wonderfully strange things. I mean, we don't see them in the house, but like that, then all of a sudden you're like, wow, that clogged up.
Yeah, that can really hit you. Whew.
Yeah,
incredible. And so anyway, apparently in the way these buildings are built, which are basically only 2 stories above the ground and 1 story that's half under the ground. So it's only 2.5 stories, right? So apparently they don't have to do the L, but from each part of each building, the buildings are very long, so they have like 10 or 12, maybe as many as 18 apartments in it, but they're only 3 high. And so they've just taken these pipes and gone straight down. And if you're on the bottom floor, Katie bar the door, man.
Katie bar the
door. So anyway, okay, peace, everyone. Thank you for coming back to us. Those of you that did. I'm sorry we had the crash of the system there, but I trust that we have entertained sufficiently, and I'll see you tomorrow night, Jordan.
Actually, I do have that event tomorrow.
Oh, you're having Halloween tomorrow. Okay, so we will have a session tomorrow evening, and and continue on next week with Synchronicity.
Great.
But yeah, we're plugging along on 2 essays, so almost near the end, I guess. So let me just see. Phenomena resulting from the assimilation of the unconscious. Okay, that should be good. I'll handle that by myself. Yeah, everybody will love that. All right.
Nice. All right.
Peace,
Have a good-
everybody. We'll
Yeah.
see you next week. Take care
Sounds
now. Bye-bye. Good luck with the Halloween, by the way.
Oh, thank you, Skip.
What
Thank you,
what is
Skip.
your costume going to be?
I have no idea still. I've
Oh,
been trying. I keep coming up with ideas, and then I'm for some reason, for the first time ever, I want to not have to explain it. And 15 years ago, the worst explainer happened. I found a petticoat that was about 6 feet tall. So I wore this petticoat and I cut eye holes in it, but I taped id and super ego and alter ego all over it. And I went as a Freudian slip. It's,
Obviously you could easily do Santa Claus at this point.
that's true. And even with this shirt, I mean, I laugh, but I'm thinking that's just so obvious. But so I might actually go with the obvious and just get the hat. I mean,
yep. So you got to go get yourself a hat though today.
Yeah.
Yeah. if you can. So
yeah.
Anyway, thank you, Susan. Nice to see you today, and thank you to Susan Scott for being with us from